Shalom Aleichem, everyone, and welcome to another edition of a very special edition of Shmoozing with Avi. Tonight, hopefully you've all seen the wonderful production of Romy Nordlinger's The Garden of Allah, all about Allah Nazimova. And tonight we have the privilege of being able to discuss that particular show with Romy, as well as with a very special guest and a very dear friend of mine, Erin Feldman. But we'll start with Romy. Romy Nordlinger is a New York-based actor and playwright whose TV roles include Bull, Manifest, FBI, Law and Order, and numerous independent films, including the soon-to-be-released feature, The Good Egg. Her acclaimed solo show, Garden of Allah, is based on the life of trailblazing Broadway and silent film star Allah Nazimova. And the show has been performed at the Kennedy Center, as well as Theater 555, 59 East 59th, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, the Jerry Orbach Theater Center, the Here Theater, the Jewish Museum, the Players Club, and Dixon Place. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to invite to join me, Romy Nordlinger. Romy, so I am so grateful that you're here.
And I am so grateful to be here. And that was the best bio reading. I'd forgotten about some of those theaters that you mentioned. So
well, I'm glad I could remind you. Most of the people watching right now have just seen your program. And those who missed it will be able to see it anytime, as it will stay on our medium for at least a few more days. But for those who may not know, would you tell us a little bit about how you discovered the story of Allah Nazimova and how you came to write the play, and tell us about Allah and the amazing life that she lived?
The famous question, how did you hear about Allah Nazimova? And a wonderful woman, a theater historian who was also a very famous casting director of soap operas and at ABC, Marilyn Henry. Now I'm a member of the League of Professional Theater Women. She knows I write and she likes my acting, and she was working on, she knows, my gosh, her understanding of the history of theater is, it's just boundless. And she was putting on a production of something she was calling Stage Struck, which was different explorations, monologues of actresses who may not be known but have been incredibly vital on Broadway, in theater, perhaps in silent film. She mentioned a few to me, and none of them had I heard of, and a few of them, and they all sounded very interesting. I mean, really, there are so many actresses that we do not know about that were meteoric. But for my purposes, the people she mentioned all just seemed sort of wayfish and blonde and consumptive, and I didn't really just feel it. But then she said, I know who, Allah Nazimova. She's Russian, she's Jewish, both of these things I am. Actually, she fled Russia, as my family did as well. So she's a Crimean, a Russian who fled the Tsars. And her persona was huge, but she was one of the, is this the right word, progenitors of Stanislavski. So although her facade and so many of the films and so many of the parts that she created in silent film and as one of the first female writer, directors, and producers in Hollywood, and there is more I'll go into about that, but her foundation was Stanislavski and the method, and her bringing real method acting, the kinds of stuff that's internal rather than just coming from outside in. She was working the opposite way. It showed in her work. She inspired playwrights such as Tennessee Williams, who said, it was when I first saw Alla Nazimova from the Peanut Gallery of the American Theater that I decided I must become a playwright. Eugene O'Neill, I mean, the list, Noel Coward. Of course, she helped introduce and bring Chekhov, Strindberg, and Ibsen to fame in America. These are just some of the few, Eugene O'Neill. And the list goes on and on. I have no idea how she remembered all these parts. Well, I could go on and on about her. It seems, hopefully by your seeing the play, because the question always is, by our audience having just seen the play, it's always, why do I go see a play about this person, Alla Nazimova? And they always walk out going, why have I not heard of this person? It's just interesting to see. It's harder to get people in to see Alla Nazimova. By the way, the pronunciations, I never knew how to pronounce it. I should do a video of all the different pronunciations because it's funny. And who the heck, how do we know? But to realize that there was a Broadway theater named after her, she was commanding a salary. The Schubert, she made them something equivalent to $400 million in 1913 or 10, making a salary higher than Mary Pickford's, and creating what the first is regarded as the first art film and one of the biggest, one of the most famous LGBTQ films in history. These are just some of the highlights of Alla Nazimova, besides having an amazingly challenging childhood, which makes for a rags to riches. And I think the true story of an immigrant and a real American story.
And why do you think she's been forgotten?
That is such a good question, Avi. I mean, I could say things. Look, when you think about it, the Broadway theaters, you walk by, there was a theater named after her on, gosh, I'm going to say 37th Street, or it was the 39th Street Theater. We don't know. There's no placard to her. There's no theater. There are many theaters, the John Houseman Theater, and I'm going to be forgetting their names, that we're remembering that are men in theater. So, Helen Hayes, there was going to be a placard to her. There was some conjecture. She was only recently, and I love the Players Club, I performed there, but only recently was Helen Hayes allowed into the Players Club. And we come from a culture where perhaps this woman, who was bigger than Madonna, created the look, by the way, of Lady Gaga with the wig. There's an interesting picture of her and Salome and the wig echoing. I mean, Lady Gaga was clearly influenced by her, but she was ahead of her time. And I think she threatened, as a woman, she broke a glass ceiling way before the words glass ceiling ever arose. And also her sexuality. Who knows how much, as things went on and as people found more about her and her bisexuality and her, she was actually just a free person. She just wanted to live her life and be herself. And that was, really unheard of.
And I've seen your play. She was a lover of life.
That's a great way of putting it.
She was a lover. And when I say lover, what I really mean here is not just people, but she loved life so much. And so it didn't matter whether it was male, female, or both. She was a real lover. When you sat down to write the play, which I think is so beautiful and so well done, how did you decide what parts of her life, and specifically, the LGBTQ side of it, because we're talking about the decadent 20s, that was like the thing back then. And then, of course, we went through, periods when suddenly that was frowned upon. how did you decide what to, put in the show and how much to tell?
Good question. I mean, if it were a TV miniseries, I think it would be a very good miniseries. It's an epic story. It's taking us from Russia to New York, Lower East Side Yiddish theater, of which she was one of the leading, the chosen people. She was her first big hit, and one of the big names in Yiddish theater, to Hollywood, to LA. And how do you tell somebody's story, their heart, in an hour and 20 minutes, and without giving the show away? For me, as you had mentioned, it was her propensity, her belief in herself, and what she imbued, how she was passionate about life, that drew me to her even more than the outside success, which was meteoric. And then when things did not go in, I read her journals, part of her journals. One of the greatest things written was by Gavin Lambert. The ultimate biography is Nazimova by Gavin Lambert. But there's scads more of material I read as well. But when I read her still believing in herself after things went awry, externally, and her joy in just being alive, and I decided, now that is the person, that is a person to be reckoned with, because their definition of success is not lying within what other people think of them. And yes, of course, I'm sure she's no saint, and she had her ego. I mean, we all do as performers, we have to, and as human beings, but there was something there that I just thought, that is a person to be reckoned with. I don't want to give the show away, because she had the Garden of Allah. How do you pick moments of her life? She was a concert violinist that was like a prodigy, and she was an abused child who her mother left her. Her father beat her as he saw her fame rising as this prodigy, as a violinist, and then she was passed on from orphanage to orphanage. She created herself in many ways that she had to survive in the streets, to take herself to the Moscow Art Theater. I'm saying this because she went on to have this Garden of Allah, which was, this is a part of the play. It's gone through many incarnations, as many plays need to do. Pat Addis, who is a wonderful producer, five-time Tony Award winner. She took an interest in the show. She still has an interest in the show, but she said, I want more about this 20s, this party, this Garden of Allah. This was a place that hosted perhaps the greatest never-ending party of the 1920s through the 30s. And it was easier to say who didn't check in than who did. And wild times that you just could, from Rachmaninoff to Marlene Dietrich, I mean, the list goes on and on, but the greatest stories, a place of liberty. And I thought, Pat said, we need more of that. We did. It's part of her heart, creating that place. And I found this trope of the violin being an echo of her life, that early success, that early failure, the playing Chekhov in the cherry orchard, and then having her career as a meteoric film star, and ending up going back to theater and still finding joy there. I found these particular echoes that they've reverberated upon themselves, and they became the tropes, the things that to me were her heartbeat, that created a story, that created the arc.
Great. That's really wonderful. I'd like to invite my dear friend Erin Feldman. Let me tell you a little bit about her first. Um, she is a queer feminist playwright and a circus artist who pens plays that are wildly theatrical but deeply intimate, formally ambitious plays that move and take up space, plays that are questing, wrestling, and asking, plays without answers, plays about women and queers, about outsiders and searchers, plays grappling with voice and agency, opportunity and access, history and its weight, plays about the human connection, plays that seek to be a greater communal, rare theatrical event in which something transcendent transpires for those both on stage and off. It is my absolute honor to invite my dear friend, L.M. Feldman, to join this conversation because I think it's really important that we get and have a real discussion about this. So, Elle, you want to join us, please? There you are. Hey.
Hey, that was really lovely. Thanks, Avi.
Yes, well, thank you. I'm privileged to have known Elle through many incarnations and for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, I think the first thing we ever did together was the bad friend, the bad friend. Elle, you want to tell us a little bit about your background, your history, your family history.
Do you mean like an artistic journey or like a Jewish journey or like a queer journey?
Let's start with the Jewish journey.
Okay, the Jewish journey.
Where you were brought up and what kind of Jewish family it was, and
Yeah.
how your upbringing got you to where you are today.
Sure.
And then the artistic journey, which, as I know, and many people who know your work know, is so extraordinary. And we'll eventually talk about A People, because I still think it is one of the most important Jewish plays of the 21st century. But let's continue, please.
I grew up in Miami, my grandparents lived on, my dad's parents lived on the lake on Miami Beach. My understanding is like when it was like the older Jews, the kind of like enclave of everyone. So we did things like we went to Moe's for breakfast and we went to Wolfie's when it used to be open. And and both of my grandparents kind of had roots in New York and Brooklyn, I guess, and New Jersey, maybe. And so there was kind of a like whatever the strain of Jewish is that is from there, but ultimately before that from like all around Europe, that makes its way down to Miami, because there wasn't anything particularly Miamian about us. It felt like a much more, I don't know. They raised us in a conservative synagogue, and then at some point there was a rift, which I'm sure is part of like the seeds of a people, like how seeing Jewish community start to like fracture itself. But there was some kind of rift when we were children, and so then we were like half the families went to the Reform synagogue, so we were there. And then I found that when I got to college, I was hungry for a kind of Jewish identity and a Jewish culture and a Jewish understanding that I didn't yet, like, that wasn't as full as I wanted it to be. And then when I got to, and I learned Hebrew there, although I've forgotten it all now. When I got to grad school, I met my first like female and feminist rabbi, and I was like, and queer. I was like, oh, okay, talk to me. Like now I have an entrance in. So I think my relationship to like Jewish heritage has been one of like being inside the house, outside the house, knocking on the door of the house, wanting to be out of the house, wanting to come back into the house, wanting to change the house, running away from the house.
Right, and build an annex on the house.
Yeah, so it's been a lot of push-pull.
Right, and where did you go to graduate school? Just so we should all know.
I went to Yale. I got my MFA in playwriting there, and that's where I met my the rabbi who like kind of opened the door for me, where I was like, able to finally have conversations I felt like I wasn't able or allowed to have until then.
Right.
You met the rabbi in Yale, like in a temple, or as a part of Yale's professorial?
I don't think she was there teaching, but I do think she was hired by, I don't know, but I think by like, I think she was hired by Yale. Like I assume Yale has like different hires for different religious leadership. And so there were several rabbis there, and she was one of them.
But she wasn't part of the drama department. She wasn't part
No,
of
no,
the
no,
So
no.
you searched her out because you were looking for a Jewish connection.
Yeah, I was looking for a Jewish connection, and then I was like, oh, that's neat. You're a female rabbi. That's cool. So like I have all these feminist questions about like how to relate to this religion when you're a feminist. And then I was like, oh, you're queer. Well, I have all these queer questions about how you relate to this religion when you're, non-normative in certain ways. And so it like I've asked a lot of questions around like, for me, the religious culture, the start of it is it's so patriarchal, it's so and straight in its like textual origins, that's where the like, at least in terms of the voices that still exist that we have access to, they're so often overwhelmingly like male and straight. So it was really hard for me to figure out like, here is this incredibly like text-based religion and culture and heritage that was authored by people who didn't include me or my identity, my body, my perspective, my experiences. I don't just mean like me as an individual, but like the categories I fall into. And so like, what do I do about the fact that it was kind of written without my voice or without my agency, without anyone who was representing my voice or my agency? None of us were in the room where that happened.
Well, and Judaism in general is such a patriarchal, male-dominated religion when you go back to the roots of it. And even though women were supposedly held on a pedestal, religious Jews to this day, the first prayer after they thank God for waking up is to say, thank God I'm not a woman.
Right.
And so this is something that I think you specifically have dealt with extraordinarily well in your play, A People, which I hope very much the world will get to see more of.
I want to read it here.
COVID is going away.
I'll send it to you.
Please, please.
So I want to open up the conversation a little bit, because Romy, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is straight. I'm straight. You are not. But today the conversation is really about the LGBTQ plus community and the Jewish experience, and the arts, and how do we reinterpret it into the arts? Alla Nazimova, okay? So here is this amazing character, this true to real person who has been all but forgotten in our theatrical and film history. And yet she was the biggest star who was not afraid to be who she was or who they were, because maybe they would have been they today. She was sexually open to all possibilities. She had her garden where she had parties, and the idea of sexuality became open. I think that as we look at the history of Jewish contributions to the arts, we find that that is actually a recurring theme all the way through, no matter where you go, leading all the way up to today. There are so many LGBTQ figures in the Jewish arts field. Can you guys tell me your perspectives on how the Jewish experience and the LGBTQ experience through your experiences have brought you to where you are. Elle, you want to start off?
Sure. I mean, when I think about things that feel kind of intrinsically Jewish to me, maybe I feel like question asking feels intrinsically Jewish, and it also to me feels intrinsically queer. And I think if, like, when I think about queerness, I think about like people who exist in the margins, people who are in the liminal spaces. And so often that means like the outsiders, the non-mainstream. Yeah. And so there's something about, you know, being Jewish in a country and in a like culture that's like overwhelmingly Christian, and who's like, you know, the way work is set up, the way the week is set up, the way, I mean, all the systems we're a part of are part of the people who had the power to set up the systems. And so it all comes from like a Christian culture. And so growing up there and kind of being continually reminded that that's like, you're not that doesn't reflect where you come from or who you are or what your rituals are or what your values necessarily depends. But like, so I think there's something about that outsiderness and like walking through it and seeing it and feeling it all of the time and internalizing it, that feels like kindred spirits between being Jewish and being queer for me.
Romy, outsider, Allah Nazimova came from outside.
Absolutely. And so many people,
touch
a friend of mine said, you know, and he's gay, but he just said, you know, this is the story of the underdog. And I also feel, and I thought, and it just stuck with me because there's so many people that identify with her story, which I feel is a little bit in her being gay, bisexual, but also Jewish, which is the outsider underdog. There's something to those two things, outsider, underdog, which, and one thing I didn't say about my finding Ala Nazimova, or what led me, and I talked to Avi about this briefly, is her Jewish identity. My blood is all Jewish, but I was not raised I was raised in a non-traditionally religious, I was raised Unitarian, which is believe whatever you want. And if you want to go to temple if you want, but you know, everything has been just sort of learn what you want. But I have felt like an outsider. I think now more and more there's this, I'm diverging, this is, but that was part of what brought me to Nazimova as well. But there's this, we're going into a time of authenticity, people proclaiming who they are. There's lots of backlash as well, consequently, as we're seeing. But I also think with Jewish performers, I think Sarah Silverman talked about this recently, and you know, in casting, people are wanting to cast, you know, if you're Hispanic, cast an Hispanic actor. If you are, you know, African American, I don't know, obvious things, but they have not happened. We have not had enough of this diversity, but also Jewish people, we need to be playing Jewish parts too. This is also, Sarah Silverman called it Jew face. Why can't, you know what I mean? It's very interesting. It's just, sorry, I just had an audition recently and I thought this works because she's Jewish. It made me feel more comfortable. And it has helped me. Theater has always been how I have learned in my life. It's experiential learning. And so it's helped me transform and find out aspects and facets of myself. Sorry, that was all over the place. I also want to say about Alla Nazimova, she was not completely out. It was tricky. It was tricky. She had a lavender, what they call a lavender marriage, but at the same time, she created what they call the sewing circle, which was code for all women's lesbian gatherings. So in a sense, she was playing with fire, doing what she needed to do in Hollywood. In the end, she was completely out, but I can't say it was all just like whatever she you know, in the end it did ruin her.
Right.
But
It was probably a little more acceptable for women to come out than it was for men, certainly at the time.
I mean, we think of all the suicides of men in Hollywood, like Montgomery Clift, or things, you know, that aren't overtly, that we don't go, wow, that was because they were gay, and it wasn't that long ago.
So there's an interesting, thing that comes up for me in this discussion. Jews, because they were always the underdogs, because they were the outsiders, because they were the, my enormous minorities, because they were separate, because there was persecution. There was always this drive to do, to create, to be. And that's, I think, one of the reasons Jewish representation in the arts and in many other fields is so significant. But I find that, as Jews became more and more accepted and more assimilated and more, politically part of the world, we now find, here's the gay community, the LGBTQ community, that in the last several years has also suddenly found itself gay marriage suddenly becoming, that to me was a miracle. I never imagined in my lifetime that I would see in the United States of America gay marriage. And yet here we are in 2022 looking at the state of Florida and a don't say gay bill. And we're now reverting. So I guess my question to both of you, and Romy, why don't you start us off, is the idea that how can we, performers, artists, try to bring to the forefront these important struggles that we have, whether it's as Jews or LGBTQ community members? How do we bring it to the world in a way that well, frankly, is not going to be dangerous?
Good. I was such good questions and enormous. I one message about all, I think for all of us, and I'm sure we all equally feel this as performers and writers and artists, is to keep telling your story. And in whatever guise or character that is, keep telling the stories. It's so important to see people walk out, people that I've watched people that are 15 years old going, oh my God, if she could do that back then I, can come out. Or likewise, people that perhaps are much older that just did not realize there could be alternative ways of looking at things. And art has always been the royal road to breaking through the politics to some emotional vein in which we can all relate. And we all as human beings can break through this walls that have been built up politically. If we can get ourselves to the theater or to the screen or wherever it is to witness, then we can feel something.
The idea that there is danger involved.
Right. And just today, I was meeting with a director and trying to work on a piece, and it is about alternative views of parenting. I am not a mother. it was going to be a play about not choosing to have children, which, by the way, I still feel pressure about. It's just traditionally entrenched in our culture, in our archetypes, and probably recessive genes and things that go back. And it's interesting to talk about. But right now I realize it can't just be about that. It also has to be a play about choices because of what is going on with abortion rights right now. So what do I want to address about this? And how do I make these thoughts cohesive? And what is important to put out there? And I'm facing that today. I spent all day, and I've been spending sleepless nights thinking it has to be this. I have to talk about this. We have to talk about this, but it can't just to be a didactic sort of, well, nobody, we all just turn off. I'm sure you both feel that, and I'm sure that's just an overtly, sort of, okay, of course we know that thing to say, but what else can you do but keep creating your truth, particularly while there's so many things being taken away from us. It is hard to concentrate, I find.
Right. Elle, you want to tackle the danger of all this?
I'm curious, Avi, what to you seems like the danger, and who's in danger?
Well, needless to say, I've experienced anti-Semitism. I did a performance in Austria, of all places, in Innsbruck, and there was a post-performance party, and everybody was very nice. I was doing a Jewish show about a Jewish writer, and it was very well received, and it was in Yiddish in Austria. And at the party, there was a young man who was standing in the corner looking at me, and he was looking at me, and sooner or later, he stopped looking and came forward and said, "You have a very big mouth for a Jew. Maybe I should shut it for you." And I had never experienced anything quite like that. And he was shouted away by everybody else, was just so, anti what he was. And they threw him out of the party. And I was scared to go home. So here we are living in a world now in America. And Romy brought up the whole abortion issue. We're now looking at a possible, Roe v. Wade going away, contraception going away. Maybe they'll try to get rid of gay marriage. Maybe they'll try to get rid of interracial marriage. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. So when I say danger, I mean danger. But I feel like we can't back away. So that's why I wanted you to be on this panel, Elle, because your play, A People, to me is just a magnificent exploration of all of those things in one big giant chunk, in a big stew of these issues. So can you talk to that a little bit about your creative process and how you integrate the Jew, the LGBTQ, and the danger?
I mean, it's interesting. I guess I was curious. Yeah, I don't have any answers. I think I write plays to ask questions in like crafted ways, but they're just questions. I mean, talking about danger for me, what it kicks up is like, in what ways are you in danger, and in what ways are you not in danger, and how can you, in the ways you're not in danger, support the people who are in danger? And then in what ways, when you are in danger, when it's you, what calculated risks do you want to take with your art, and where can you share it in ways that don't, like based on your own risk taking? So I think like I'm not in as much danger as a white person. How can I support anyone who's not white in the telling of their stories? I am in danger as a queer. How can straight people support me in the telling of my stories? I'm in less danger as someone who's not trans. How can I support trans artists in telling their stories? I am in danger as a woman. how can men support me in telling, like, so I sometimes I think about that, and try to break it down a little bit. I mean, not clinically, but just like being aware about intersectionality, and that I hold certain kinds of privilege, which help me be safer, and other kinds of places where I don't hold the privilege and I'm more at risk. So that's, I was just thinking, I think a lot about that, I guess. So that's something I hold with me about danger. I mean, in terms of like, what is there to do? I mean, I guess I keep thinking like, not only keep telling the stories, but like, what are the stories that aren't being told? Whose are the voices that we're not hearing? For me, what stories can I contribute that I don't see generally shared, that are my stories to tell, or my questions to ask, or whatever? Like what, where do I fit in to that like puzzle of stories? And then what are the stories that are, I don't know if it's like not mine to tell, but are like not the stories that I can tell, but aren't out in the world, and how can I be an ally for getting those stories out in the world? But I tend to think about like, who has the microphone? How do we share the microphone?
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
what are the stories we need to hear?
yeah, I mean, you and I have had separate conversations about pieces like Indecent. You know, Paula Vogel, you know, and Rebecca Teichman created this magnificent piece also about a dangerous piece from 1920s, God of Vengeance, Sholem Ash, and the first ever scene on a stage on Broadway of two women kissing.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire cast and crew getting arrested for indecency.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, I'm afraid a little bit. I never thought I would be, but I find myself a little bit afraid that we're heading back towards that kind of an American, you know, just the idea of censorship, the idea that the day might come when we are going to be forced to not tell these stories, or not allowed to tell these stories. And then how do we tell the stories? You know, I think back to the Holocaust in the 1920s and the 30s in Germany, the most cultured country in the history of the world. And look what happened.
And we see this too with like, I mean, particularly in the former presidential administration, I feel like we see it with like danger for like academia and the intellectual community, danger in the like press for like for journalism, like in addition to in the arts, where suddenly like there are forms of, I mean, to say nothing of like complete censorship that's happening over like news coverage in Russia. So there's just, and we're seeing it in like many countries right now. So it doesn't like here, but also it feels like globally there are regressions back to more controlling conservative regimes, and that's terrifying.
Right.
There's definitely fascistic inclinations that are very quickly, very, very frighteningly quickly coming, all encompassing.
And in that situation, I feel like then I started to think about like, how do you create covert art? What are the subversive ways of, you know, like if it can't be in the open, then it's got to be underground or it's got to be slipped in. And so how do you start to create like a vigilante form of art?
Interesting that you mentioned that, because during the Holocaust as well, what I've learned in my research is that there were thousands of plays, concerts, poetry, songs written by the creative forces of the time that were very critical of the Nazi regime, but it was masked. They were using the theaters to actually support the underground, the partisans. And, you know, there would be a scene where they would say, the baker baked a dozen bagels. And that meant for the guy in the back of the house that there were 12 guns at the baker. that if he went there, there would be like 12 guns and 12 knives. And, you know, there were all these underground ways of doing the arts. You know, it's amazing. I could talk to you guys forever, but we're already, you know, heading towards 45 minutes here. Let me start bringing this to a close by asking each of you, what would you say to a younger person today who is trying to come to terms with their own artistic identities, both within the Jewish and the LGBTQ worlds? What would you advise them? How would you guide them? And how else can we not back down? Elle, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I was trying to think about what I would tell my younger self. I think I'd want her to know that there's that the art that the world, or the world that she moves in, is showing to her is a sliver of the art that exists across like places and times. And that the best thing she could probably do is find the person who's like her, if she can, or ask the people who can lead her to the person who's like her, and then say, like, who should I read? Like, show me. I think about how much my world expanded the moment I met someone who was able to be like, oh, you've only been reading these things? Go read these things. You don't know they exist? They exist. Go watch this person's work. Go. And then suddenly you're like, that's possible. You can do that in art. There are people like me. I mean, all the way up until now, I'm still discovering like art and characters and narratives that start to reflect things. Like I realized for the first time, like, wow, I've never watched on screen two women get married in my life. And I see it for the first time 2 years ago, and I'm like weeping, and I'm 40 years old 2 years ago. And to realize that I've lived 40 years and I've never seen anybody of my gender marry anybody of my gender on screen, like as part of the narrative that like we grow up with and we internalize. And so something about that, about like who can like throw open the like fences so that you can play in all of the artistic fields of people who are writing your stories.
Right. Romy?
I think it's akin to what Elle is saying, but the thing I think about as I'm older, that keeps me doing what I do, if I didn't have this sense that has been growing within myself, I would have quit, because it is painful. There's a lot of rejection in this business, as we know, and it is not an easy road. And very much like Nazimova, making your own definition of success rather than prescribing, adhering to, and the media is so all pervasive now, and I can become just as, you know, toxified with it and intoxicated by, you know, everything from looks to, I mean, it's just, there's so much coming at us, particularly for young women. And I would say to try to remember what our own definition of success is, which even the word success, what that really means. Because if you're constantly chasing after what you think everybody else is going to be thinking is successful, I don't know, maybe you'll be happy, maybe it will work for you. Maybe you'll drop out because you won't attain what they think is, or maybe you'll have ups and downs. I'm not saying it's always easy, but but to try to find that thing in yourself that is your definition
Mm.
of
Right. Don't be
following your bliss.
afraid to be you, and to express yourself.
Yeah.
I'd like to close with a thought. I feel that, the biggest problem we have in our society is the idea that we don't accept others. We're not taught to accept others. A very, very dear young man committed suicide. Someone who I knew very well. He was very close to my family. He was Jamaican. He was African American. He was Black, and his parents were ultra Orthodox and could not accept the fact that he not only was he gay, but he wanted to have a female persona, and they couldn't accept that, and he suffered and eventually took his own life. And it's a terribly tragic story. I feel that, we need to figure out a way to teach children from the time, you have to be taught to hate, right? Isn't that from South Pacific? You got to be taught to hate. If we could teach children from the time they're in preschool to the time they're in college, how to accept others, no matter what their color, religion, gender, whatever it might be, we have to teach acceptance. And until that happens, I'm afraid we will always continue to have these conversations. So final thoughts.
I think
Well,
beautifully said, and go on.
no,
Well,
go for it.
The only word I wanted to add to that struck me, and it's Tennessee Williams, who's one of my favorite playwrights, and what I firmly believe in life, and is empathy is everything. Empathy, and without it, we're husks. We're never going to get to that place that we're speaking about, and empathy. So yes, we need to learn empathy. The planet, the very planet, every sentient being that is alive, we need to have empathy for ourselves and for the other beings. So,
Elle, final thoughts?
I guess I was thinking about visibility, about like there's teaching acceptance in theory, right? But part of what helps culture accept the like vast variety of humans who live on this planet is seeing the vast variety of humans who live on this planet. So in terms of where art is concerned, that's like, how do you put as much art of as many different kinds of people and experiences on stage as possible, or in writing, or like, and would it have, I guess I think about like other people, like the friend you lost, and how vital it is to see yourself reflected in the world and know that you exist, people like you exist, and how hard that is to do when you're from certainly one marginalized identity, let alone like many. And then how vital it is for the parents or the family members or the community members of anybody to also see like the vast array of people who exist. So something about the role of art in seeding the thing that makes acceptance possible, maybe, or like maybe that plus empathy.
yeah, that sounds
But,
right on.
but you know what? I think you're right. And I think that today, we are kind of at a crossroads, because on the one hand, there's an enormous amount of visibility. Shows, reality TV shows, RuPaul's Drag Race, I Am Jazz, which I was telling you about before. I Am Jazz, here was a young boy from the time he was born, he knew he was a girl. And so from the time that little girl went to elementary school she wanted to wear dresses and grow her hair long and play with the girls and be with the girls and be a girl. Well, now she's a very successful reality TV show where we, the audience, have followed her through all the years of her adolescence. This is a series that's been going on for years. Through her adolescence and through her physical transition to becoming a she. And so, you know, and so there is visibility. The dark side of that, of course, is that there are those who hate having to have it in their face and having it be visible. And now their forces are getting stronger in the against. Don't say gay, burn the books, ban the books. I mean, I can't believe that we're banning books in America. It's just tragic. It's tragic. But I'm hopeful, because as long as there are people like you, Romy, and you, Elle, in the world, creative forces that are going to bring these stories to life, I think we have hope.
And
as
you,
long
Avi.
as we have hope, well, thank you. As long as we have hope, I think you know, we can make it work. So I thank you both for being part of this panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. You know, you can always go to our website, whyilovejewish.org, and you'll find a lot of very, very important and interesting work, and we keep the hope alive. So, Hashem Dank, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, guys.
Thank you both so much. Thank you.